Western civilization is moving closer to a point of irreconcilable, unstable equilibrium, as frighteningly increasing numbers of people trust nothing. Media, academia, and especially the governments are no longer held in high esteem. Regaining trust is often impossible after betrayal. However, transparency is essential to any healing process, and that is the essence of the Don Sullivan Show. Please listen to the team explore, probe, and debate cutting-edge science, technology, and computing. Play ball! Welcome again, loyal audience of the Don Sullivan Show, back to another episode of the show that talks about everything science, technology, and computing. And today, again, we're going to prove our bona fides when it comes to the breadth of science, technology, and computing, in which we are going to discuss architectures and the various different ways of creating building and art. Oh, how about that theme? Remember that theme? Where art meets engineering? Well, that's a second branch. We've talked about timepieces where art meets engineering, and today we're going to talk about architecture in another branch of the where art meets engineering sub-series of the Don Sullivan Show. But again, thank you all for coming back again and listening to our 50-plus episodes. Remember, this is a show that discusses everything science, technology, and computing on an American teenage level so that everybody can understand as much as possible about all the science, technology, and computing out there that you aren't necessarily exposed to. So today, like I said, we're going to pivot to architecture, and I'll introduce him in a second once we do my disclaimer. We have a great guest on from Washington, D.C., architect and designer extraordinaire, Fredrick Taylor, Rick, as he has been known to his friends and family, including me, who is kind of part of his family, as Rick and the great friend of the Don Sullivan Show, Dr. Theo Hodge and Rick are married, and they are great friends of me and have been for my greater part of my whole life. And Rick is an architect extraordinaire, and even though he's too humble to admit it, is going to give us an absolute expert understanding and presentation of the history of architecture as a science and an art, which is exactly what we had hoped for here. But let me start off here by issuing our disclaimer that I always hate to do, but the lawyers insist on it. The many lawyers that we have, and of course, this huge Don Sullivan Show audience. So all statements by the host and the guest on the Don Sullivan Show are the personal opinions of the host and the guest, who all agree that the following content is the property of Xanalytics LLC to be used publicly and exclusively on the Don Sullivan Show. And although you in the audience can't see it, because this is audio only, everybody is shaking their heads up and down, and we can now actually proceed with actually having some interesting overall discussion. So let's start off here. Rick, want to just say hello to the audience, give us a quick introduction to yourself, and then I'll let Stephen go into some promotion.
Good afternoon. My name is Rick Taylor. As Don said, I am an architect. I'm in private practice in Washington, D.C. Have been for about the past 25 years. After coming here to work for a major firm for about 7 or 8. And I do everything, almost my entire practice is single-family residential, alterations, additions, and new houses. So I'm very close to the actual users of most of my buildings, even though sometimes I work for developers.
Okay, we're going to talk a lot more than that, though, today, Rick, and hopefully this will be the beginning of the sub-series of where art meets engineering, human architecture. Stephen, how you doing today? You're on with me today, and you don't have to make comments in the background.
I'm doing well, Don.
I can't believe the stuff you said about me while I was under anesthesia. I don't believe it's amazing.
Well, you know what? You asked for some commentary, and I certainly delivered, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
Well, greetings from the Garden State, everyone. Today's episode is brought to you by License Fortress, the industry's first and only software asset management firm to offer both a financial and legal guarantee at its highest level of service. Whether it's Oracle, Microsoft, or VMware, License Fortress helps organizations stay compliant, avoid audits, and save money. Learn more at licensefortress.com. And please support our producer by visiting axtinc.com. That's AXTINK.com. Subscribe to his YouTube channel and help support his efforts to create humorous animation and escape the Puxatawny, Pennsylvania time loop he's been stuck in by learning empathy and self-improvement. Back to you, Don.
Did you contact Bill Murray about that or something? Or what? Is he friends with Bill Murray?
He may be.
Yeah.
They both don't have much hair at this
That's
point.
true.
I don't
That's
know.
true.
But
you know,
we're gonna have to get him on here soon.
Bill
to talk
Axe
about
is
some of
50 years
these-
younger than Bill Murray, but you know this Groundhog Day
Probably
thing
around
is-
there.
Okay, we'll have to talk to him about that later. All right,
Yeah.
hey Rick, let's start off here and see if and tell me if my initial assertion has merit and that architecture is really both engineering and art, and where is that overlap? Or give us your take on this.
Well, if you look at architectural history, one of the earliest authorities we have on record is Vitruvius, who was a Roman architect. And he didn't use these exact words, but it's come down to us that that architecture is to provide three things: commodity, firmness, and delight. Commodity, that means it's supposed to meet a program. It's supposed to shelter you. Firmness means obviously it has to stand up and be strong. But delight, that's the third piece that it has to bring to. It's got to bring something more than just rude shelter. And so if you think about it in those terms, the art is the delight and the engineering is the commodity and firmness. Well, actually, the commodity is actually the human user. The engineering is the firmness. So the thing you make has to do those things. And so that's why architecture is not an art in and of itself. But I always like to say that if it's done well, it can rise to the level of an art.
Well, that's a great explanation and actually a pretty pithy one as well, and something that I really completely agree with. And so I'll ask you let's go through the history of the world and tell me
all of it.
Yeah, all of it. You know, in little steps, but all of it.
We're going to move fast.
Lofty goals for today's show.
Yes, we get at this entire planet today and all of human history. I'll put it that way. Not the history of the world, but human history. And I'm going to ask you about the pyramids. And the pyramids, of course, have been found all over the world. And there's all kinds of theories about, or hypotheses in regards to how they were created and so on. But does that qualify? Other than, we'll say, the Sphinx is obviously a piece of artwork where we have no idea of what the reasons for that particular image were. But the pyramids themselves, do you think that was more practical? Do you think that was artistic, or is just the pyramids, not the art inside of them? But do you think that qualifies to start with?
Why? I guess in a way, I'd ask the question. It's a built form. It has a purpose, so it meets the criteria for. It's a tomb. It's pretty simple. It meets all the criteria for commodity and firmness and delight. It's the pyramids are the sort of inevitable and not logical, but sort of the ultimate conclusion of the first pile of rocks our Neolithic ancestors piled on their dead. And in a sense,
wow, I never thought of it that way, but that's totally true. Yeah, just pile up.
It's a really fancy version of that.
And if you think about how that would have happened and why that's architecture, why, in point of fact, I would argue that the tombs are, and architectural historians would bear this out, are the first architecture we have. Because there are very few remnants of anything other than tombs dating to the era of the pyramids or before that. There are dolmen that dot the world, which are basically very crude pyramids. There'd be some large boulders set into the ground, and then a capstone put on top, and then be covered with dirt. And that was the tomb of a chieftain or something. And they would put the things in with him that would make him comfortable and happy in the afterlife. But it was all, and that's where it started. Now, if you think about, if you pile up a bunch of rocks, you're quickly going to have problems. And this is sort of just me pre-associating. Think about going to the grocery store and seeing that pile of oranges. The pyramid. Why do they do them that way? Because they'll fit together and they don't have to be mortared together. Well, that's kind of the origin of a pyramid. That's the sort of, it's become rationalized. So then they thought, well, we can't make it any taller than that or it'll fall down. And so they started applying aesthetic criteria to these piles of rocks, and the that was not so. That was not the only things that they built, but they didn't build other things. Their houses, they didn't build those to be permanent. Those were people were nomadic until fairly late in history, and houses were just the crudest shelter you can get away with. Now, obviously, the king would have something a little bit better.
Well, they got the irrigation systems in Middle East.
Yeah, but
yeah.
The aqueducts.
If you want to talk about the aesthetic aspect of architecture, you go back to tombs and what they were. Of the seven wonders of the ancient world, two were tombs: the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus and the Great Pyramids. A third one could qualify as a memorial because the Hanging Gardens were sort of built to satisfy the homesickness of the princess supposedly that the king married. And so all in a sense, one important architectural theorist from the 19th century, John Ruskin, said that all architecture is memorial. I actually looked this up yesterday because my dog-eared copy of his book. He said, talking about architecture, he said we can worship without her, we can live without her, but we cannot remember without her. All architecture is about creating memories, or it harkens back to things we remember.
And you're right. That really is fascinating.
It was not my
Rick.
thought. It was not my thought.
Yeah, I understand, but it's all. When I think of historical architecture, tombs, churches are another big one. Obviously, I'm skipping ahead centuries, but when I think of really big, cool-looking things that were built in history, a lot of it's memorials, tombs, or kind of churches or religious. A lot of attention paid to the afterlife, it seems.
Well, if I had the chance to teach a college course, I would, on architectural history in a studio course, I would call it tomb, temple, and tower. Those are the three elements of the tomb is where you put your dead. And once you got those guys kind of satisfied and we've covered them, then we'll turn our attention to the gods. And then finally, when the dead and the gods have been satisfied, let's gussy up our houses a bit. And then you have the tower, which is also defensive. And you actually see that element in even Renaissance houses. There were still vestiges of fortifications in the design.
So as they moved along, in Egypt in particular, from the earliest examples of the pyramids in Giza to the Great Pyramids and down through the Valley of the Kings and the tombs underneath the ground, it seems like they got better over the millennia, really. Do you think that they understood in a primitive way the mathematics, or they just kept eyeballing it until they got it right?
It's interesting. That's a great question. Because if you see that same pattern in almost every aspect of architectural history, especially at that period in time. And I'm not an expert on the pyramids, and so I'm going to sort of shift away to thinking about something else, is the Greeks and the orders. If you look at the examples we have from the 600s to in the span of like 600 to 450 BC, you see the evolution of the orders from early examples which were just really odd proportions to our eye, and quickly they become more regularized and more that's what we recognize as the Doric order. That's what we recognize as the Corinthian order. And it was as if they were seeking a preordained perfection or proportion that was now we got it. I always jokingly say my brother's a machinist and he will define, said, is that part good? And he said, no, it's off by 0.003 of an inch, and he has to throw it away. And an architect looks at something and said, that's a little too wide, a little too narrow. That's right. We're all about getting it to and it's really that
aesthetically
at that level.
Aesthetically.
Exactly.
Which is very interesting. And I just realized this, Rick and Steve, this is exactly how the watchmakers think. And we have this whole sub-series again, Rick, on timepieces, and their level of precision in that is utterly exquisite, but yet it all comes down to the aesthetics. So it's both.
Well, exactly. If you could meet the programmatic requirements of my clients' houses without me. You could get them a shelter that would keep the rain out and keep them warm in the wintertime and drop cold and cool in the summer. but they don't hire me for that. They hire me to bring the delight to it. That's
Want a
our job.
specific look. Yeah, they want purpose and functionality, but they want it to look nice a certain way.
Right. And I always tell people that the purpose of architecture is to dignify habitation.
Dignify.
And
dignify is a word I didn't expect you to use.
The purpose of construction is to create habitation, but the purpose of architecture is to dignify it. And
I would have thought you would say, and sorry to interrupt you, but I would have thought you would have said beautify first before dignify.
Beauty is an important quality, but it's not the only one that brings that. To dignify something means that you're paying attention to how people live on a granular level, and you make sure that there's a place that when you get in, you're coming into a house, there's a place to stop and pause before you get in the door that's covered. Little things like that.
Yeah.
That's part of it. And so the line between what is a practical and a purely aesthetic alteration, there's no way to define that. There's no way to separate it cleanly.
So it's true, because you can have a foyer that's absolutely beautiful, but totally impractical. There are different decisions that get made inside and outside houses that well, there's a balance between one thing and another.
I would back you up just a little bit and say, if it's too impractical, you failed on the commodity test, and you need to back up and think about it again. Because, and an aspect of commodity that we all have to deal with is how much has a client got to spend on it, and that's been an issue forever. And spend in money, spend in your labor,
in resources.
How many people have you got to pile the rocks up on your grave? That sort of thing.
So let's move ahead a couple of millennia and compare Greece and Rome. Now, Greece is Greece in general, all of the different city-states is a philosophical culture that has defensive capability and by philosophical you mean early science and so on. Whereas Rome is a warlike culture, very mercenary with law. But the commonality is they both have incredible architecture, maybe more aesthetic in terms of Greece and the Parthenon and pillars or temples of Hercules and so on. And Rome, more practical with the aqueducts and some of the palaces and so on. But that commonality is still there. Am I right about that?
Yep, you are. And you start with the Greeks. Their architecture was incredibly sophisticated on an intellectual and aesthetic level, but it was really pretty simple. It was columns and beams. The Romans, they added the arch and the dome. The other thing that the Romans added was concrete. And the Greeks didn't have that. The Romans did.
The Romans knew how to compose sand and whatever else is comprised in concrete.
Sand and the binder into concrete. And in fact, a lot of people probably don't realize it, but the Dome of the Pantheon is concrete.
I did not. And I've been in there. Holy cow. I did not know
the oldest concrete structure in the world. And concrete technology was lost when the Roman Empire fell. The interestingly enough, I looked this up too. The dome at Hagia Sophia, which is only right after the fall of the Western Empire,
Istanbul,
still part of it.
For folks who don't.
In Istanbul, that is actually masonry. That's brick, and that is a brick and mortar dome. But the Pantheon is concrete, and it's a fascinating structure. The oculus that does two things. It admits light, but it reduces the lateral forces on the roof. They also were really smart. They understood the walls are incredibly thick, and it tapers as it gets closer to the top of the dome. The circle does, and at the top of it, they use lightweight aggregate pumice, as opposed to other types of
volcanic pumice.
Yes, exactly, because it's very light. It actually floats, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it does.
Like a level of engineering that was pretty sophisticated, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was. Now, personally, I partly because you don't get a chance to do a dome in residential construction very often, but you do use columns and beams. So I tend personally to mine the ancient Greeks and their modern descendants more than the ancient Romans. But it's fascinating. We were in Athens this summer and a few years ago, and the proportions that the ancient Greeks had never completely went away. Even modern Greek buildings share that. And the other thing is, Roman buildings were structures that were dominated by walls, whereas Greek structures, at least what we call architecture, were really dominated just by columns. They were open air pavilions almost.
How interesting. So that is aesthetic versus practical to it.
And the further north and this is also the Greek orders were borrowed by the Romans. As they borrowed the Greek orders, they borrowed the Greek gods, they gave them new names. They didn't bother to rename the orders. They kept the same names: Corinthian, Ionic, Doric. They had another one in Roman architecture called Tuscan, which is probably the most commonly used today because it's the simplest, and it's the one that looks most reasonable in American suburbia. It gets a Corinthian column looks pretty fey on a house these days, and usually isn't done very well. But it's the Romans a city-state does not require the level of engineering that an empire does.
Okay, we'll take that. That's I'm not sure how that applies to modern times, but that's for a different subject. But that's interesting. Yeah. So let's move forward again another millennia to what I know is your absolute favorite subject, Florence.
You keep saying that.
It is, isn't it?
It's a great subject, but I'm not an expert on it.
Yeah, I know you're not an expert on it, but you know a lot more than us and most of the folks in the audience. So we're going to talk to you about this. Am I pronouncing his name right? Berlusconi? You've corrected me a couple of times.
No.
Okay.
Brunelleschi.
Brunelleschi's utter complete genius. And I commissioned by the Medicis, I think, right, to build this unfathomable Duomo in Florence. Duomo.
Yeah.
Duomo in Florence. How did they do that? How did they actually build this incredible dome? It took 75 years or whatever
well, that's a pretty quick sprint for a cathedral.
Okay. Back then.
Really, right? 75 years is that was fast for them.
Yeah, I think St. Peter's took about 100 years and about a dozen architects.
This is also why we don't see these things around the neighborhoods over here in New Jersey, Don. That's just way too long.
Well, you have to watch The Sopranos.
Nobody remembers the stuff here, though.
Well, that's only because the Pope can't impose taxes over here.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
But no, the Duomo is now.
Hey, look, this guy's from Chicago. We don't know what's going to happen, but go ahead.
Well, the Duomo is an interesting story because when they started it, they wanted to do an octagonal dome, and it was huge. And it's the first time they've really tried to do a dome in many, many centuries, because Gothic cathedrals were very complex engineering feats, but they were buttresses and that supported roofs and the throats. But here we got a dome, and they also wanted to do it without using buttresses. So they had to figure out how to counteract the lateral thrust of a dome with a lantern on top. And when they started, they didn't know how they were going to do it. And there were a number of issues that made it even more complex. One is, when you're starting on these sides down here, how do you make sure it's going to take the arch to the right point? Centering the dome was a real complex challenge. And I have to confess, I read the book Brunelleschi's Dome many years ago, and I have kind of gotten rusty on how they resolved the problem, but it was a big problem. Plus, but that alone did not solve the thrust. That just figured out how to get the dome, how to get the lantern in the middle of the dome.
I mean, this would have been a problem for modern surveyors with modern survey equipment.
Yes, it would have been. It would have been. But the other thing they had to do is, how are we going to counteract the thrust of this dome? And they were very worried about it. They didn't have engineering guidebooks that told them the formulas to calculate this stuff. They were kind of winging it. And the way you made sure the cathedral would stand up, you try, and if it falls, you try again. This one, they didn't want to do that. And so he devised the ring of wood and the ring of iron. It was a ring, basically a system of very large chains that wrapped the base of the dome on the inside the dome. And there was, if I'm not mistaken, there's also the ring of wood. So they did all these other things that were designed to counteract that thrust that in the Middle Ages and even with the Pantheon were always counteracted by weight on the outside of the structure. So suddenly they're counteracting the force inside the dome with things that resist it by using tension. So that's a big.
But they had a guess. I mean, they could take weight.
They were using whatever. I don't know what basis they. I'm sure that Brunelleschi had many sleepless nights worrying about whether the dome was going to stand or not. So having been there, I've been in the Duomo and up to the top, into the lantern. And it's not a huge lantern. Now, we'll get to it in a minute. And I'll remind me to be sure to ask me about how they support the dome at St. Paul's in London, or the lantern on top of St. Paul's. But
I've been there. I know that one.
Yeah, there are two domes, an inner and an outer, and a pyramid and a cone that holds up between them, that holds up the towers. Anyway, the lantern. But you were asking about the Duomo, and that's you have exhausted my knowledge about the Duomo. Just so you'll know.
Why did they build that? Was that also a religious thing? Was it for
the Duomo?
worship?
Yes, it's both.
I didn't want to say cathedral because it's not shaped.
It is.
But
okay. It is. It's also a civic monument, because you got to remember, in 1420 there was no Protestant Reformation. There were the occasional reformers. They just burn them at the stake and go on with things. So a dome like that was a big civic monument, and it's dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the Santa Maria del Fiore, Saint Mary of the Flowers. Well, that's the symbol of Florence. So the Duomo is a monument to, it's religious monument. It's very much a monument to civic pride.
That's interesting.
All cathedrals in that period were. There was no such thing as, we think of church and state as separate. They didn't look at it that way. This was all one.
It was kind of bragging rights too. Like,
well,
if you were
the
leaders
in that
area,
absolutely.
Look at our cool dome. Nowadays, all the domes are like for football or rock concerts or like baseball.
and they're basically inverted. We look down and they're open to the sky, and you got an inverted dome, and people sit on it.
Yeah, some of them have roofs, but they're not created or constructed the same way. Obviously, the ones that can slide in and off.
And they're civic monuments to your team. That's a big deal. They don't have quite the sort of, how shall I say it, the spiritual gravitas of a cathedral.
No.
So, I mean, this is the time of Cosimo.
Well, it depends how much you like the New York Giants, or your favorites.
Pretty hard to like the Giants right now these days.
I know some guys who view MetLife as spiritual.
We'll see if Belichick comes back, and maybe we'll see, who they bring in. But we digress.
We'll see.
So, I mean, this was the time, Rick, of Cosimo de' Medici, the real first major power broker of the city-state of Florence. I mean, his father, of course, started the whole Medici clan, but Cosimo was the first real major political dynamo, before. And it was part of that was the purpose of, just as Stephen just said, showing off that we have this power and ability beyond anything the Papal States can possibly put out. And of course, later on, the Papal States wind up having a lot of control over Da Vinci and Michelangelo.
Well, and there were more than a few Medici popes too.
Yeah, well, later, right? But
so you have there's all that. It's interesting. It's almost as if this one person decided, I'm tired of this old way of doing things. I'm going to find this. I'm going to get myself a studio of artists and put them to work, and we're going to do something new.
I don't think that's not almost. That's exactly what did happen, along with creating the whole notion of free enterprise for Western civilization. They did that too. So,
Well, the Medicis were, and the interesting thing about the Medicis, if I'm not mistaken, they were commoners and bankers.
They were bankers, and they started right after the Black Plague, and Giovanni started the whole clan, and they created microfinance, in which people win Nobel prizes in economics for in the modern times, but they started it along with being the bankers of the popes. And they created themselves as power brokers, particularly with Cosimo, what we're talking about here. And then, of course, Lorenzo later had, he was a patron of so many of them and so on. It's really an incredible story. But again, we digress to a maybe different show. So you want to talk about St. Paul's a little bit there, Rick, before we go on to the next.
It kind of naturally follows. I mean, we should at least pay passing heed to St. Peter's, because you can't really think about St. Paul's without St. Peter's.
True.
And because in a way, St. Paul's was very much a response to St. Peter's. St. Peter's was the Pope's answer to the Reformation. We're going to and in fact, well, take that back. The Reformation was a response to the taxation that the Pope, partly at least, a taxation that was imposed to pay for it. So in its number of architects that were involved in that over the years, so there was a half dozen at least. The most famous, of course, was Michelangelo, but he was not the first, nor was he the last. And the number of architects that touched it spanned over close to 100 years. Anyway.
Well, let's go forward a little bit now to modern times, Rick. It's very interesting, and I don't think there's a better example than New York City with this. But in the earliest 20th century, we saw magnificent architecture. I mean, the Empire State Building took 370 days, I think, to build in 1933, whereas the Freedom Tower took 13 years. So, and obviously we have tremendous government bureaucracy in that, but even more so, things like or buildings like the Chrysler Building in New York, what I consider the most beautiful building I've ever seen in my life. I love the Freedom Tower, but the Chrysler Building is still, I've got it, Alexander Chen painting still on my wall here of the Chrysler Building. Whereas now, when you look over at the skyline, you have these unfathomably tall apartment buildings.
Those Park Ave buildings.
They're not allowed to be higher than the 1776 feet of the
I think one gets up to about 1,500.
They do, but they're chimneys
because it has that cool penthouse on top,
which can't be sold at $250 million. Nobody will buy it. But it's.
If I had the money, I'd buy it.
So what's going on with architecture in the world in terms of the art? Because it seems to be diminishing tremendously towards the purely practical. And I certainly don't mean to be political.
Not the purely practical, the purely profitable.
Well,
okay.
Well,
so is it because that's most cost effective?
Those things are vanity projects that they can get top dollar from the very wealthiest people in the world, because they will vie to live on literally above the other ones, and they're hideous. They really are.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately it's the triumph of engineering over aesthetics, because they're apparently from this. They're not all that functional. There are some tremendous problems that those sliver buildings create in terms of systems. But you started out talking about the Chrysler and the Empire State Building, the early 20th century skyscrapers. And you have to kind of back up just a little bit and talk about, well, how can we have those? And the reason we can have those is because we have structural steel construction. And that didn't come into play until the late 19th century. And your earliest skyscrapers in Chicago were all of 10 and 12 stories tall. And they found out very quickly, you can build the tallest masonry skyscraper is 16 stories, and it's in Chicago. Problem is, when you start building tall, in masonry, the foundations and the piers at the lower levels have to get thicker and thicker and thicker. And then there's no floor area left. Same thing happens if you're doing it in concrete, but in structural steel has tremendous compressive strength, and so the structural system itself doesn't have to get that gargantuan as it goes up. And so it was over the course of from 1890s to about 1912, when they built the Singer Building, they went from maximum height of 12 or 15 stories to 60.
And
So you had
Question. Oh, sorry.
go no go you go ahead,
ahead.
Stephen, because it just got bigger and bigger within the next couple of decades and more
Right.
beautiful, and then it kind of waned off. But go ahead, Steve.
Well,
Well, now,
here, but when I think of like really cool buildings, I guess, or skyscrapers, I mean, you could certainly look over at Dubai or even
Kuala Lumpur,
what's the one? Kuala Lumpur. What's the one with the where it's three towers, but they have a whole
Singapore.
other thing. Yeah,
two
Singapore
towers,
with
the
pool.
Petronas.
Like, yeah, they're cool. Like Dubai's doing some cool stuff. I don't know if it's practical or if people would regard it as beautiful the way
At
historical
least there's
things are
some
beautiful,
thought
but
of beauty into it, as
it's
opposed,
different.
yeah.
It's
There you
different.
go.
There's like a
That
design element to
that
it.
that Don, you hit on it. Somebody thought about making it beautiful,
Yeah.
and that's what. And you can have very different when you get to these newer types of structures. You can have a wide range of what somebody's going to consider beautiful, and there's some stuff going up in China that is just, to my eye, perfectly hideous. But there's people out there that just think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Well, it's
Not
very
me.
practical. Like I say, it's very practical, very cost effective, and I think
No,
that,
not necessarily.
yeah. Go
Well,
ahead.
nobody's going to build a commercial structure that is not cost effective. But the architects are going to look for what they're looking for in some of these things is the way to be the next wow. And that's really not a good way. That's not really, in my mind, a good way to make good architecture. I think the architects that did the early 20th century architects, they had a sense of what of making they were making new things. It was a big deal, but there were some laws that came into play in New York City about stepping skyscrapers back so that they didn't create these horrendous dark canyons, and they worked really hard to do that at the same time making the buildings profitable. And there was this, the Art Deco was the perfect stylistic vehicle for a skyscraper. It suited the type. You didn't get it. You couldn't really do a great classical skyscraper. They're not, the forms don't lend themselves to it. But Art Deco did, and that's why that was such a marvelous confluence of aesthetic and practical concerns, because it was the perfect marriage of form to purpose.
What is Art Deco? When somebody says Art Deco, for whatever reason, I think of Miami, but I don't know if that's accurate at all.
Well, it didn't. The term dates to the 1925 exposition in Paris of les arts décoratifs, decorative arts, and so it got shortened in to the words Art Deco, and it really kind of a summing up in shorthand of what things looked like then. And you had buildings had that. There, certain posters were sort of a big Art Deco thing. There's fabrics, furniture, anything from that period will have aspects of the Art Deco about it or not. But it was more of a reference to a mood and sort of a streamlined aesthetic. Think about the images you've seen of locomotives from that period. That's the Art Deco.
Oh, that's an interesting. That is a very interesting, not quite metaphor, but comparison. I never really thought of it that way. We tend to think of now cruise ships as skyscrapers that are floating on their side.
And that's another one. That's another great example. Ships are a perfect vehicle, no pun intended, for the Art Deco. And in fact, vehicles are because it's the streamlined moderne is one of the ways we describe it, and it's all about implied movement. Well, buildings don't move, or at least they're not supposed to.
San Francisco, maybe,
and,
yeah.
and rarely horizontally.
The Pentagon, right? So,
Yeah. Well, that's a different
well,
one.
I mean, that's kind of horizontal. The Pentagon, it's bigger horizontally than it is vertically.
That's an interesting case study too, but not one I really would delve into too much, because I'm afraid I would misspeak about some of the history of it. It came into being.
Is that the biggest building on Earth? Is it still the biggest building on Earth? It's huge, right?
I don't know. It has the biggest. They manage the biggest budget on Earth, so probably.
There you go.
Yeah.
So let's move forward towards aspirations. Rick,
Okay.
I'll tell you two buildings that just continue of the 21st century that stick out in my head that I'd love to have your comments on. And one of them is, if you've seen it, the Art Museum in Denver, which I found bizarre beyond belief at first when they were building it, but it has so worn on me. I've been in there many, many times now, and it just seems totally.
I'm not familiar with it.
Well,
But
it
I'm
just
going to look
okay.
at
It
get
just
a picture.
seems like it's got different directions of structures that have all been put down almost like an ice crystal that is all over the place. And I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah, it's wild. It looks a little Vegas to me.
Yeah,
It's
that's
got
true.
like, if you want to look it up online, it has this big triangle
But
pointing out in
the
one
Yeah, I'm looking at
direction.
pictures of it right now. It puts me in mind of the work of Frank Gehry or Zaha Hadid, who both do these sort of super sculpture. That building is, it strikes me as a habitable sculpture.
a habitable
It's
sculpture.
yeah, because
Yeah,
people
that's a good way to
you
look at it.
but and the same thing can be said of the Guggenheim in New York. Who does the spiral to display paintings in? Can you imagine a worse
It is
way
kind
to
of
display a
wild.
painting than on a ramp in a round building with slanting walls? How do you get a painting to sit on that wall? It was an insane idea,
That's
but
Frank Lloyd Wright,
it's a
isn't
great
it?
mind.
Isn't that?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
So that might be an example of, it wasn't all that practical, but it was kind of aesthetically cool.
he had been wanting to do a spiral building for decades, and finally somebody gave him a shot.
Would he be an example of an architect that was aesthetic over practicality? Somebody, I forget, when we visited one of his houses in Arizona, they were saying, yeah, most of these leak, but they look really cool.
Oh, Frank Lloyd Wright did not realize that he could not command water to stay out of his designs. And
Gotcha,
if you,
gotcha.
if you, and I know this from a direct personal experience. When I was a child, our nearest neighbors was a family that had a summer house. It was designed by the Taliesin Fellowship and may have been worked on by Wright himself. And it had the classic Taliesin West concrete roof. And this was in a ravine in western North Carolina. Well, they had tremendous structural problems almost from the get-go. But my God, the thing was marvelous. We ate dinner with them one time. I was 6 years old, and we walked into this house, and my little proto-architect brain was just blown. And I thought to myself, I am the most sophisticated 6-year-old in all of Green River Township, because that house was just amazing. Sadly, it's been destroyed. But that was one of those cases where you've got these architects that push things to these extremes, and you have to be willing to live with what that gets you. Frank Gehry is a great example. The museum at Bilbao and everything he does. We were in Paris a couple of years ago and saw the Louis Vuitton Center, which he designed. It was an astonishing thing, but you don't know, is it architecture? Is it sculpture? It's really hard to describe it. And nobody's going to, or at least they shouldn't try to, nobody's going to try to use that as an example. Now, Prairie Style and Frank Lloyd Wright, you can see his influence naturally extending into different work of subsequent architects, and it's not craziness. Frank Gehry and things like that, that's a very personal effort, and somebody's got to want to have bragging rights to have a Frank Gehry building.
So
I think we could kind of compare those to they're like the Richard Milles
it's
of
a very, very
buildings.
high-end timepiece collection, Rick.
Does it tell? But does it tell time?
It does, but nobody cares.
If you look them up online, they are
they
pretty
go
crazy
between
looking.
like
and
$1
no,
and
I don't
$5 million
think
a piece, and it's
Yeah, but do they tell time?
they do, but again, nobody cares.
They do their job. You can make the argument that a building that can't keep the water out or doesn't meet its functional requirements
Yeah.
is falling down on commodity.
Yeah, okay. I get
that's
the
true.
point. Yeah.
That is true. Yeah, I mean, I only mean to say very, very outlandish. What is just to change subjects here, is there a term or category for the architectures we kind of see today with how they're renovating hotels? It's like kind of a corporate modern look, or is that not even categorized? It's just kind of like whatever.
It's hard to apply stylistic terminology to your own era. That's going to come later. There's And the other thing you got to remember is what we see right now in our own era is a cross section, everything from the good stuff to the dreck. When you go back and you're looking at what, and when you go back and look at what's left from 100, 200, 300, 500, 1,000 years ago, the dreck doesn't get preserved, only the good stuff. So you kind of got to weed your way through and see what deserves to be looked at. I always jokingly say I want to be the ideal anonymous architect. So when I'm dead and gone and somebody comes along and finds one of my buildings and they're going to remodel it, they look around at what I did and say, oh, this is nice. We'll keep this. So that's good. That's all I need.
Let me end up this discussion on this point. And of course, the audience of the Don Sullivan Show knows we endeavor in every way to keep any political sentiments out of these discussions because they're just not necessary. But I am going to bring up something here because of who it is that I'm going to mention that might lead people to think in that direction, but it's not meant to be. Rick, I want to ask you, where do you see this going in the 21st century? We're in the second quarter of the 21st century in the last week or so. And where do you see it happen? Where would you like it to go? And then in the context of that, the most prominent building over the last couple of years in the world is the Obama Presidential Library. And I look at that and I think he had $1 billion. And why? And am I missing something with that? Just, from an aesthetic and whatever perspective?
It's hard to say. I'm looking. One of the things that's happening now, and I think this is a part of. There are two impulses at work in architecture. One is to make things sort of ponderously and aggressively monumental, and on the other hand, the move to eschew anything that partakes of the traditional language of monumentality, and that would be this, and by contrast, you've got the potential new ballroom at the White House. I mean, they are striving to be totally different things.
Yes,
and I'm not sure either one is entirely successful, and I don't think either one is successful at what it's trying to do. And I think part of the problem with the Obama Museum is it's the same problem with a lot of buildings that come up in this period. New buildings, they don't want to partake of, frankly, styles in Obama. Think about this. Historical architectural styles were used as didactic political statements. You had the Great White City and at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, and that was in some ways the architecture that was deeply associated with state-sponsored racism. In the same way you had classicism in Germany in the 1930s associated with fascism. I had a professor at Yale who was Germany, Leon Krier, and he did a presentation of his work. And he's a traditional designer. He does beautiful, beautiful houses and structures. And he was in a lecture and he was getting very emotional. He said, people call me a Nazi. I'm not a Nazi. That's horrible. But the reason that happens to him is because he was practicing classicism that had become, after Albert Speer had come into such bad odor in Germany, they threw it away because of all those associations. And that happens to some extent everywhere.
Where would you like to sit?
The Obama Library kind of looks almost brutalist to me.
It does. And I spent 3 years in a brutalist building at Yale Architecture School. I know them well. And they wanted to make sure that spoke of looking not at a past that was tainted by negative associations. I get that. I think it could be better. And it's easy to criticize a building after it's been put up.
And you're right with the comparison on the other side of the spectrum. The ballroom, when it's done, at least from what we've seen in the pictures, is going to be ostentatiously opulent for the purpose of, showing off. And
right.
That may
it's very like old school and kind of almost like 80s
Gilded Age
and like
Gilded Age kind of opulence.
Yeah, well, it's Gilded Age, but it reminds me of 80s Trump.
Well, yeah, that of course.
Well,
be the case.
Look, it's. I will say this: it speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that we talk about these, because also we're getting onto another topic. in a way that we probably don't have time to touch, but how styles can have representations and associations completely beyond what you're looking at. The Greek Revival was a romantic style in Europe that spoke of the movement toward newer forms of government and newer forms of society, and every generation that took on these things added their associations, for better or for worse, to it. The Gothic Revival in this country had certain meanings to some people. It's a whole topic in and of itself, is what styles mean to people.
So where do you want to see it go, Rick?
Well, it's a tough question, because I do little tiny projects. Little what I would call interventions for homeowners, and I love doing it, and it's great fun. And I think about all the things we've been talking about whenever I pick up a pencil or a computer mouse anymore. And I'm always working within the canons for myself of traditional design, which has its roots in classicism. There's a lot of bad classicism out there, and there's some really good stuff. And it's for me, it's not a dead language, and I don't think it's the right language for every building. It's what I do, and kind of like Norman Rockwell, and people were shocked to learn that he enjoyed modern art, looking at what he did, but he did, and
I'm sure he
just
did. Yeah.
points out you can do different things, and you can like things that are different from what you do. But it's not. It's dangerous to fall temptation to say, now I can do anything. I'm going to do a modern building. I've got a client right now who I'm going to be working on. He wants to do a much more modern take on a house, and I'm a little nervous about it, because I've got to deal with the context of a nice suburban neighborhood, and I've got to make it fit in. There's nothing more depressing to me than driving along through a sort of boring but innocuous suburb, and suddenly somebody who got new money does some huge, big, gigantic white modern box that doesn't fit in at all. It makes
will it look dated in a decade or so? That's the other question.
Terrible now, and it makes everything around it look worse too. The goal for me is always to put something in that place that kind of brings up the tone generally and makes the other stuff around me not look worse, and that communicates. It's part of what is. Part of that's because I do a lot of buildings in historic contexts. And so you're always working again. Okay, I've got one coming out of the ground in Alexandria that's on a lot, the last empty lot on an historic street that has been empty for 200 years.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And we've got brick houses, got a wall of traditional houses on this side and the other side. And I've got to put in something that does two things. It's got to fit in, and at the same time sort of tell you that it's not that old. And we feel like we did a good job. We got it through past historic preservation review on the first review. And that's not always the case. And it's going up now, and God, every time you have started building it, you have this feeling of, oh God, what's it really going to look like? And I told the builder, I said, because it's a significant site, and I said, we will either be inundated with work or be forced to retire when this is done. And so it's a great opportunity. And what happens next? God, I work at such a small scale. It's hard for me to have big opinions about urban design, for example. It's like, that's one thing I'm heartened to see, is that houses are getting smaller.
You're not a fan of the McMansion era, I'm assuming.
I will confess now, I used to work the dark side of the force. I have done my share of spec houses for developers. But 20 years ago, you were putting 7,000 square feet on a quarter-acre lot in Bethesda, Maryland, and they could sell them as fast as you could pop them out. Nobody wants that anymore. The 2 spec houses that I have done since then have been less than half that size. And what's interesting about
please continue.
And they're better houses. We spent a lot of energy and work, or at least I did, on those monster houses, trying to make them look like they belonged in neighborhoods built of fundamentally smaller houses.
So now
whereas
the scientific thinking of design and efficiency is much more important.
Well, the truth of the matter is single family detached dwellings are architectural dinosaurs. And I recognize that I designed them. But if you think about the efficient use of material, how the cost of heating and cooling something that's a freestanding little bubble versus row houses or multi-unit, there's no comparison. It isn't. They are
Never thought about that.
They are excessively self-indulgent. It was because but I can only do so.
Let's see. That was the American dream, though.
It was, and we give that sort of stuff up very hard, and I get that. And there's going to be a market for that for a while, but it needs to be adjusted somehow, so that we can do a better job of making things that are more human. One of the we in a sense we're adding one more criteria for architecture. We've got commodity, firmness, delight, and the other one might be sustainability.
Oh, sure.
Because
I don't think the younger generations can really afford to build McMansions anymore anyway, despite the fact that they were ugly and not in mass.
And
thinking about New Jersey, you had a lot of towns where they'd creep in and it would be these huge McMansions on postage-sized lots. They can't do that anymore.
Even the people from that generation who can afford that, by and large, don't want that. They live on their phones. They get Uber Eats. They don't need a big kitchen, although that will be the last room to die. Because the big island with a 4-foot range in the middle, that's the vanity strip. That's the vanity thing for everybody. They'll put that in a room they'll put those in a house with no dining room. And
I have a dining room. I am a fan of the old school dining room. That is a hill I will die on. But I know they're dying out.
You live in Morris County. You got a lot of space.
It's interesting that one of my houses that I'm doing for developers, it's a tight little house and it's on a corner lot, a tricky lot, and it's got the obligatory kitchen family room combination, but there simply wasn't room on the site to do a big house that had a living room and a formal dining room. So we actually combined the living room and the dining room into the grown-ups room, and it's a very elegant room, and it will be just big enough to hold the dining room table and a couple of sofas in one room. And you can throw the kids in the family room with the kitchen, and they can forage, and you can have a conversation, a glass of wine in the other room, and be as far from it as you possibly can in a little bitty house. So we're excited. I'm excited about it, and that is not groundbreaking architecture, but I think it's I think it says something that's worth considering on other projects. We've had to condense houses little by little, and once rooms get to a certain scale, they can't get smaller. They have to be combined.
Well, you know what?
So do you think open concept will continue to open concept trends that'll continue to be pretty popular? That seems to,
they're getting less popular, actually.
Really?
Yep.
Like by open concept, meaning like the den and the kitchen and the dining room are all, kind of all one thing. That's not as popular anymore.
People are beginning to realize that if you've got that kind of plan, you got a messy kitchen, you got a messy house.
Oh well, yeah. I'm sure it didn't work well over the pandemic either, with people trying to work in
and that may be part of it. You
house with the kids.
There's a lot of reasons for it. When I remodeled my house 20 years ago and did a new kitchen, people said, "Oh, you're going to open it up to the dining room?" And I said, "Not on your life."
I like I like walls. I like like
separation.
For example, I have an office. I can close the door. I like separation and compartmentalization in my life. To be perfectly frank,
these are, and I do both. I do not tell people how they're supposed to live. What I tell them is, okay, if this is how you're going to live, this is how you want it to be. Here's how we need to make it look. Occasionally I can be a little bit of an art. I can be a little bit, or I can try to be dictatorial about it, but it doesn't usually.
Highly suggestive. Guys,
one of my favorite lines with the client was, "If it were my house."
On that note, Rick, let's end this up for today, and I'll say a couple of things.
I've gone too long.
No, you haven't gone too long. That's
okay. We're gonna have to get you back because there's more to unpack
Rick,
here.
We hope, like like Dr. Theo, we can consider you a friend of the Don Sullivan Show and have you back on every few months to talk about updates or new buildings that we see or all kinds of things. Because despite your humility, you are an absolute reservoir of knowledge that we want.
Well, actually, I don't. I am not. But Wikipedia is. I actually did a little bit of. I made some crib sheets, so I wouldn't. So I would not speak.
You know, Rick, you knew what questions to ask. People don't, and that's the reason for this show.
That's you have a point. I knew what to look for.
Yes, and what I would say to you is not only tremendous good luck tomorrow. I'm very, very flippant about surgeries, especially with myself, which there will be more of. Vast audience of the Don Sullivan Show coming up.
Watch that last episode.
Oh, there'll be more of it. Good luck to you, Rick, and I will say.
Not watching
go ahead.
I'm not watching a surgery tonight.
No, don't do that tonight.
And I will again reiterate that both you and Dr. Theo, I love having you as close as you are to me in my personal life, and it was one of the great honors of my life participating a year ago in your wedding, and I thank you for that, and I thank you for being on the show.
We were delighted. We wouldn't have had it any other way, and we will have some. We will. I'll tell you what we should probably do. We should make a point when you're in Europe this summer together to talk about to continue this conversation and figure out where it wants to go next.
I think we will absolutely.
That'd
be
cool.
And
bring your recorder.
I always do. You know that. You're getting better at commenting in between. But all right, folks.
You guys are great. You guys are very good at this.
Well, thank you, Rick.
We have fun. We do. And before we let you go, Rick, one more question from me. Lightning round, real quick. Favorite architectural period / paradigm? What do you like the most?
Is
it like picking your favorite child?
It's kind of like that. I'm going to pick my. Now, I can sort of do that. I think that the period, oh God, it's hard. The period that I go to for the most inspiration is American residential architecture from about 1880 to 1930. That was before that's a whole nother question as to why that is the case. But that's really
I wouldn't have expected that though. Late Gilded Age.
My house was built in 1933, so I just missed out on your ideal period.
No, that's within it. It's really the last heave of architecture, of traditional architecture, that was the product of all those centuries of knowledge before modernism came in and said we're going to sweep all that away. My generation has had to relearn that from scratch.
Wow!
And those guys, it was in their bones.
Stephen, more?
That's all I have for today. It was an absolute pleasure, Rick. Thank you for joining. And
you are most welcome. I had a ball.
So, folks, just got one thing for you to remember. You don't know what it is, and I'll spring it on you. That no matter what we're doing, no matter where we are, if I'm climbing up mountains, if I'm in the middle of Alaska, I'll be climbing some big mountains in the near future. If I'm going down canyons, or if I'm under anesthesia, remember, folks, that no matter what you do, the best advice that you can possibly take from me or from anybody else is that all at-bats are situational. And see you till next time.